of semiconductors, putting real stress on our car sector, to give just one example of very specific supply chain problems that we were focused on and thinking about. The second area we were really focused on, which again has moved more into what everyday people are talking about, but we were focused on it already in January, was we could see, partly because of those strained supply chains, that inflation was elevated and rising. And so it was apparent, I think, to us that we were going to be moving from the COVID recession situation, where the challenge was, prevent the greatest downturn since the Great Depression in Canada from really taking hold and scarring the Canadian economy. That had been the preoccupation during COVID. We knew that we were moving into an environment where the challenge was reopening and elevated inflation. And how do you deal with that? And that made us particularly concerned again about the supply chains, because they posed a challenge to elevated inflation. So I would say that was kind of my finance minister budget-related set of concerns. The second economic issue that I was very focused on in November, December, January, was the U.S. Build Back Better legislation, and in particular their proposal on EV incentives. And, I realized to an Ottawa kind of maybe legal community type audience, that might seem a little bit esoteric. But the reality is, and it might seem a little bit esoteric and a little bit specific, the EV incentives as proposed by the US, and that legislation made its way through the House in the fall in the US, I believe in November. That legislation as proposed would have been completely devastating to the future of the Canadian car sector. What the incentives would have done, had they been passed into law as initially proposed, is create very strong incentives for buying electric vehicles that were made in the US, not North America, just the US. And EVs, that's a nascent industry, right? We're just shifting to the production of EVs. Imagine if you are a car company, and all the car companies that produce cars in Canada operate on both sides of the border. Imagine these powerful US incentives are put in place, but they only apply to EVs and batteries made in the US. Are you going to build anything in Canada? Are you going to put any of those production lines in Canada? And the answer is you wouldn't have. And, these incentives, frankly, were quite intentionally designed to drive all of the building of the new fledgling EV industry into the US only, and to create a powerful economic disincentive to build any of that in Canada. That would have been a disaster for us, because EVs are the cars of the future. And to just give you a final kind of sense of how significant this was, at the end of 2021, Mariang, the trade minister, and I sent a letter which we made public to the US, warning that Canada was prepared to retaliate at scale were this measure to be passed into law. In December, in finance, we were looking at and putting the final touches on a retaliation list, because whenever there is trade retaliation, the first step is you publish the list of things you might retaliate against. We did that during the 232 challenge, shall we say, the 232 tariff challenge. The initial retaliation list that we were looking at was going to include up to $100 billion of US imports into Canada. So that's to give you a sense of the scale that we judged this challenge to be at. Now, we didn't want to do that. We really didn't want a trade war. That would have been terrible for Canada. And so we were also negotiating. And we were talking, all of us, the Prime Minister with President Biden, Mary Ng with the USTR. I was speaking about it with Janet Yellen at the Treasury. And really, the key person emerged as a guy called Brian Deese, who is in the White House. He is the president's economic advisor. And what we were trying to persuade Brian Deese of is the idea that, look, we understand that you want incentives for electric vehicles. We believe in that too. We also believe in the green transition. We understand that you want US workers to benefit from these incentives. But our car sector is very, very closely interconnected. A favorite line that you'll hear every single Canadian trade negotiator who ever has negotiated mention to the Americans on this is a single car part can cross the border 6 times on the way to becoming part of a car. So we say that all the time to the Americans. And so what I said to Brian is, our sectors are totally integrated. We're not asking for a free ride from the US. Why don't we match your incentives? And you guys have incentives. We'll have incentives too, and both of us have incentives for North American-made EVs, thus creating a level playing field between Canada and the US, and frankly, a strong incentive for investment into Canada, because in that kind of an environment, Canadian-made EVs would be uniquely able to be sold into the US market. So that was what we were talking about precisely at that time. And in the month of December and January, we were drafting these ideas. My department was working on it, and I was sharing them with the Treasury and with Brian Deese. And actually, at the very end of January, my department prepared for me a sort of yet another iteration of this sort of Deese note on how can we coordinate. So that was sort of a second direction of economic concern. I would even say anxiety. We knew we had to make this work, coming at exactly that time. And then the final thing, which was more maybe a deputy prime minister area of focus, was Russia and Ukraine. The war hadn't started yet, but we and our allies started to get intelligence in December and in January that Russia could well be preparing to invade Ukraine. I was briefed directly at the beginning of January that the judgment was this could really happen. And again, it's happened now, so we might not fully remember how astonishing and horrifying that thought was before it actually happened. It's horrifying now too, of course. So, you know, that was a very big deal. I learned about it at the beginning of January, and the threat just kept getting greater and greater and greater. I believe NATO troops were put on alert at the end of January. And then I think the US took this extraordinary step of declassifying its intelligence about Russia's plans in early February to kind of alert everyone. And I was also involved at the finance minister level, working with other finance ministers, talking to the Ukrainians about putting together sort of preemptive sanctions. If you think back to that time, the idea was we would be very explicit with Russia about the sanctions that would snap in the event of an invasion. So we were working on that. So that was kind of a third area I was very aware of. I thought then, and I think today, that Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which of course did ultimately happen, is the biggest challenge to Canada's national security since the Second World War. I think it's a very serious attack on Western democracies, on the rules-based international order. I took it seriously then, and I believed it was really important for Canada to be in a strong position to be able to respond.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. So,
there was a lot going on.
Fair enough. In the interest of time, I'm just going to go over a couple of points and then move on. But so the last point you raised was what was going on in Ukraine. You saw a link to that and Canada's national security. So that link may not be obvious. It's something that's going on in the other end of the world. So what do you mean by that? That would be a risk to Canada's national security.
Well, Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine is the first time that one internationally recognized state has tried to conquer or seize the territory of another since the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. It's a very grave violation of what I think is one of the greatest accomplishments of the post-World War II international order, which was, a basic understanding that internationally recognized countries don't invade each other and seize each other's territory. Now, that has not been perfectly honored, but if you compare the entire post-World War II period with all of human history prior to that, it's a huge change. And that has hugely enhanced the security of every country in the world. So that's number one. Number two way that Canada's security is threatened, but I think the Allied response has been strong and has strengthened Canada, is I absolutely believe that one of Vladimir Putin's war aims, his principal objective is to crush Ukraine, to take it over, to crush Ukrainians as a people, and to replace the democratically elected government, to make it a puppet satrapy. But he has another objective, which is to show that dictatorships work and democracies don't. There is a broader goal he has in mind, and that is, I believe, in his view, because he wants that demonstration effect. He wants to show Russians, you might not like that much how things work here, but we're better than those, weak, feeble, pathetic Western democracies. That's sort of the message he wants to communicate with what he perceives to be his own strength. And his success, were he to be successful, I absolutely believe would weaken Western democracies writ large, including our own.
Okay. That's, I think, helpful context for if you'll agree with me, for what was in your mind, essentially, as the convoy arrived in late January. You've said that dovetailed, basically, with your negotiations on the electric vehicle incentives. And in the chronology, you can appreciate this is the second last day of the Commission's testimony. So we've been through a lot of the chronology of what happened in those early days. And I want to focus with you this morning on your specific involvement. And I think you've expressed to us in the interview, and you may agree or you may not, but you started to become very actively engaged in this file, in this matter, around February 6th, around the second SSE meeting. Does that ring a bell?
That's the second weekend, right? Is that the Saturday or the Sunday?
That would be the Sunday.
Okay. Yes, that's true. And that's kind of consistent with how I was describing my role. So I would sort of say up until that point, I was pretty much heads down. We have the budget. Budget is sort of 90% of the focus. And then there's electric vehicles over here. Hope we can get a good outcome. Otherwise, it's going to be really bad. And, I've spoken with a lot of conviction a moment ago about the significance of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But I want to remind us all, at the end of January, beginning of February, it hadn't happened yet. So that was just out there as a threat that I had in mind. So up until February 6th, 90% budget, EVs on one side, worried about Russia, Ukraine, hoping that we can put forward strong sanction ideas that will prevent it. But it was really budget, budget, budget. But then the second weekend of the occupation happened. And I started hearing, particularly from business leaders, that this was starting to be an area of concern. And so I did attend that committee meeting. And then as that week went on, I became more and more and more involved.
Okay. And just to clarify, you wouldn't normally attend an SSE meeting, is that
No,
right? But
not at all.
A standing invitation as Deputy Prime Minister?
The finance minister has a stand, I think they call it an ad refio member. The finance minister can attend any cabinet committee meeting that she or he chooses to attend.
So on February 6th, you sort of invited yourself.
I think my colleagues also thought it would be good to have me there.
Fair enough. Okay, so soon after that, on February 9th, your department produced an options memo. And Mr. Clerk, if we can just pull that up quickly, it's SSM.can 403764. Okay, so Minister Freeland, we've talked a little bit about this already, but I'd like you to take us through the options and how this memo came about and the two options that are outlined here, which are essentially amendments to, sorry, scroll down a bit, please, Mr. Clerk. The first option that's outlined until you get to, there we go. So would be potential amendments to the PCML TFA Act, and then if we scroll down beyond that, you'll see amendments to the Bank Act. So can you tell us how you perceived these options, how the memo came about, and what you did with this information afterwards?
Sure. And I think, so this was on the 9th, which is the Wednesday.
I believe that's
right. So, and that really was the crucial week from my perspective. And I think the blockade of the Ambassador Bridge began on the Monday of that week.
That's
So from a finance economic perspective, that escalated things exponentially. That's what made it a hugely significant economic action. And, I had started to get really worried on the Sunday. I attended the cabinet committee meeting. Bridge is occupied on the Monday. I start talking very urgently with my team, with Michael Sabia and officials. And we basically go through sort of three thought processes. Number one, is this a really huge problem that has risen to the level that we need to figure out a way to stop this? And by the beginning of that week, especially with the bridge blockade, we were coming to that conclusion. We have to figure out something to do. So then step two is, we're the Department of Finance. I think you've probably heard from other ministers. The instruction was, okay, everyone, take a look in your toolbox and figure out what tools are available to you to act on this. And so that's what we did. And we found, looking at what was in the finance toolbox, that there were basically two areas where there could be authority. One was FinTrack, which is the center that sort of monitors financial transactions, money laundering, terrorist financial activity. And then the second was the Bank Act. And would there be authorities under the Bank Act that could be useful in resolving the situation? So that was the two areas we looked at. We looked at what the existing tools available as of that moment permitted us to do. And we came to the conclusion pretty quickly that everything that could be utilized was being utilized. So then we thought, well, is there a need to legislate? And that memo outlines areas where the department said you could legislate to create this authority, or you could legislate to create these various authorities as outlined in the memo.
And did you consider those viable options then?
We definitely looked at them. As you know, I would say, let me say a couple of things. So on the FinTrack front, what we concluded was, to put it in maybe kind of more regular terms, what we concluded, and this is something that finance officials had been thinking about for a while, is that basically the FinTrack monitoring authorities were appropriate for a 20th century economy, but not for a 21st century economy. That FinTrack, and I know you guys know this because you have been over this for hours and hours and hours, but maybe for people who are tuning in for the first time, FinTrack is not an enforcement agency. The job of FinTrack is to monitor what's going on, to both look into reports that it gets and to just kind of have situational awareness and let us know what's happening in terms of illicit financial flows in Canada. I think that's a summary I would offer you of FinTrack's job. What we were sort of reminded of in looking at this is FinTrack's sort of line of sight was very blinkered. They could look into what you might call the 20th century financial system, but they didn't have authority over the 21st century financial system. And by that specifically, I mean over crowdfunding and over payment platforms. So that was a lacuna. It was well known that it was a lacuna, but there hadn't been an urgency to act. And the memo identifies this is an authority that we think FinTrack should have, and you could legislate to create that authority. Subsequently, as we all became FinTrack experts very quickly, or thought we were becoming FinTrack experts very quickly, we understood that regulatory authority would be sufficient to grant FinTrack these additional powers. And as you know, that's what we ultimately did. So FinTrack, one area. And then second area, which is outlined in this note, is could the Bank Act be used to allow the banks to effectively freeze accounts? That's basically what the memo discusses, and it discusses what would be the different authorities which would allow that. And so those were the options that were developed there. Maybe the final point worth mentioning with regard to that memo is in terms of a legislative path, what we understood was it takes a long time. And look, it's a good thing that it takes a long time for legislation to be passed in Canada, even when we're working really together and urgently and quickly. And an example, just this fall of Parliament coming together, understanding an urgent necessity and passing legislation was the bill that granted us the authority to double the GST credit, which we proposed as soon as we returned from the summer recess. It gained all party support, and it speeded through. And, we proposed it in the middle of September, and we got the first checks out to Canadians on November 5th. In parliamentary legislative time, that is a sprint. And that was good because we know that Canadians need inflation relief. But that's really, really fast from September 19th to November 5th. So, and that's just one real life example where there was urgent action by Parliament. Looked at what the legislative options could be. We quickly understood that they would take a long time.
So skipping way ahead now, but so the conclusion in the end was you did not have time to legislate.
Not that, I think the short answer is yes. Basically the legislative timelines and the snowballing sort of exponentially damaging impact on the economy, they were not, the legislative timeline was not appropriate to the scale and speed with which the damage was mounting.
You mentioned in the course of that you were having conversations and you were hearing from various stakeholders and business people, et cetera. So I want to spend a moment, and also U.S. officials, obviously. So I want to spend, not actually a moment, a little while going through some of the conversations that you were having. And I think the best way to do this is with the assistance of some of the documents that we have that may remind you of the specific conversations. So we'll start with Mr. Clerk, SSM.can.401255. So this is a summary of your conversation while it's being pulled up with Mr. Deese, Brian Deese, on February 10th. And you've already explained to us who Mr. Deese is, but just maybe go over that again. So would you say he's the senior economic policy advisor to the president?
100%. I would say when it comes to U.S. executive economic authority, the most important person is President Biden, obviously, and his most important advisor is Brian Deese. And then, of course, Secretary Yellen is a very significant and, frankly, brilliant figure and player in all of this. And we were, maybe just as a quick footnote, I don't want to offend the Treasury, in talking about these EV incentives, we were very much in touch with the Treasury, both with Secretary Yellen and with David Lipton, who worked in the Treasury. They were very aware of our proposals, too, and supportive of them.
Is Mr. Deese someone you talk to often?
I try to. What was striking to me about the conversation I had with him on the 10th of February is he is a person who is very hard for Canadians to get a hold of. And actually in the fall, when we realized how significant the EV issue was, and when in my conversations with the Treasury, I really learned how important the White House and Brian Deese were, and also our ambassador, Kirsten Hillman, sort of identified to us, Brian Deese is the guy you have to talk to. And it was a real effort to develop a relationship and a dialogue with him. And an effort to always an effort to get him on the phone, to get him to answer an email. And I don't mean that in any way to slight him. He's an extremely busy person. In a way, the fact that it's hard for Canada to reach him is a good thing. It means we're a peace, order, and good government country, and they're not very worried about us. And so what was really striking to me was how quickly he got on the phone with me on that Thursday. It was instant. And while in some ways, that was, as a practical matter, that was good, but it gave me a measure of how worried the White House was about this.
Okay, so let's look at the summary of the conversation you had with him, Mr. Clerk. If you can just scroll down to So we can see that entire part of the email.
Yeah.
Okay, so starting February 10th, so this is you, Mr. Freeland, writing. You say, he called me. They are very, very, very worried. If this is not sorted out in the next 12 hours, all of their northeastern car plants will shut down. He said that he supposed that this proved the point that we'd made previously to them about how closely integrated our economies are. He did not seem to see this as a positive. He asked what he could do to help us. I said, tow trucks, say he was aware of points 1 and 2, tow trucks and banning travel, and said he would push on both. He was supportive of the idea of a call and would try and make it happen. So can you flesh out that summary a little bit of what Mr. Deese was conveying to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think, can you move up a little bit? Just, I think the second sentence, he said that this proved the point about how integrated our economies are, and he didn't seem to see this as a positive. He brought that up. And you have to kind of bear in mind, I have been bugging the guy, and Canadians have been nagging Americans since the fall. And we've been saying, guys, you don't understand Canada. You don't understand how integrated our economies are. This approach you're taking to the EVs, it's completely counterproductive for you because we work so closely together. Those parts, they cross the border 6 times. We've been saying this over and over. And so he comes back at me and he says, yeah, okay, like you've made the point. We get it. And it was a surprise to him, actually, the extent to which their car industry was dependent on the trade with Canada. But that was a dangerous moment for Canada, I felt. Very, very dangerous. Because the US then and now, as part of their own soft landing from COVID, something that is happening there is a real move to protect the supply chains of the United States. The same supply chain challenges I was talking about earlier as affecting Canada affected the US. And I think we have all seen a very strong push this year by Americans to insulate their supply chains, particularly from China. I'm very worried about the semiconductors, but more broadly, COVID brought alive to them the vulnerability of their supply chains. And this was so worrying to me because I could see, really for the first time ever, the Americans having this amber light flashing in Canada. And this amber light that said to them, you know what? The Canadian supply chain could be a vulnerability too. And that's a problem for us because there are plenty of Americans, both Democrats and Republicans, who would love any excuse to impose more protectionist measures on us. So that line to me, it jumped out at me. It made me really, really worried. And I really understood at that point that the danger wasn't just the danger of it wasn't just the immediate damage. It wasn't just the immediate harm. It wasn't, this plant loses 4 days of operation. The danger was, were we in the process as a country of doing long-term and possibly irreparable harm to our trading relationship with the United States? And it's also important to understand that our trading relationship with the United States, it's not just about Canada-US trade. It's about Canada's attractiveness as a destination for all foreign investments. Japanese car companies invest in Canada because of our trading relationship with the United States. So that one conversation was a seminal one for me, and it was a moment when I realized, as a country, somehow, we had to find a way to bring this to an end.
And Mr. Clerk, if you just scroll up a bit so we can see the next email there. You say one final thing, he'd like to talk to me again tomorrow and every day until this is sorted out. Did that end up happening?
It didn't, because we sorted it out. So, that was a conversation on the Thursday night. You'll see from that conversation that I asked Brian to help organize a call between the Prime Minister and the President. And again, that's a very hard thing to set up. The President of the United States, the most important elected leader in the world, very, very busy guy. He also, by the way, was involved in this potential Russian invasion of Ukraine, very involved. And yet I asked for the call that Thursday. I can't remember exactly when my call with Brian happened, Thursday, sort of early evening, I think, late afternoon, early evening. The President and the Prime Minister spoke on the Friday. And then, as you know, we made an announcement on the Monday.
Okay. Just going to take you back for 1 second. Mr. Clerk, can you pull that one down and go to ssm.can 404175? So, Mr. Freeland, this is a text exchange you had on the 11th with Brian Clow of PMO.
Yeah, okay, and that's
the following day then.
That's the Friday, yeah.
That's the Friday. And scroll down a little bit, please, Mr. Clerk, until we see Windsor was supposed to there. So you say, Windsor was supposed to happen today. This can't go on. We need to show some federal leadership too. So does that go back to what you were just saying? At that point, you had decided something had to be done and quickly.
Yes. And also, that point Windsor was supposed to be today, I think it's worth dwelling on for a moment, because it speaks, to our experience in the eye of the storm, which is that we continued to hear that action was going to be taken and things were going to come to an end. And it seemed that wasn't happening. And at the same time, what seemed to be happening is we had this metastasizing of the illegal blockades and occupations. So there was sort of, copycat action across the country, sort of a whack-a-mole. And that was also worrying.
Okay, we'll go back to the stakeholders now, Mr. Clerk. Thank you. You can take that one down and pull up ssm.can 404138. So this is a text exchange with Mr. Flavio Volpe. Can you
Yes.
explain who Mr. Volpe is?
Yeah. Flavio is the head of the car parts group. He is a real leader in the car sector. I got to know him well during the NAFTA negotiations, where we had sort of a real Team Canada approach, and autos were a very important issue. And so Flavio and his constituent companies and the trade negotiators and I worked really closely together on the specifics of the deal. And Flavio also, significantly, I think, for this exchange, Flavio was very aware of the EV issue. And if I have seemed to you guys today to be kind of weirdly obsessed with EVs and US EV incentives, I would urge you to spend 5 minutes talking to Flavio, and you will understand how really kind of life or death for the car sector it is. So he was very, very steeped in all of these issues.
Okay, so if we just look at the text exchange, he says to you on the 9th, this is the Ambassador Bridge debacle is embarrassing. And then you say, let's talk tomorrow. I would love to get your ideas. I'm worried too. So the text then skips to February 14th, but we don't necessarily need to go. Well, actually, let's go there. So this is at the point, I guess, where the Emergencies Act has been involved, and you say, express to him, I know how devastating this has been, and it's been determined that we need to take strong action. We didn't save NAFTA only to have it undermined. Can you tell us about the conversations you had sort of in between these texts?
Not really, because I don't have sort of specific memory of actual things we said. And I can't even tell you 100% whether we spoke on the phone or just exchanged texts. So I don't want to pretend to knowledge of that. But, I can give you some context for that view that I expressed there, which I do remember expressing, which I think is consistent with what I've been saying earlier this morning, that all of us who had been involved in the NAFTA negotiation, very much the car sector people, but I think you'll see that I also had a text exchange with one of the steel guys. All of the industries that were very implicated in the NAFTA negotiations were aware of how Canada's access to the US market was both essential and kind of constantly fragile and in need of tending. I don't know, maybe it's like a marriage, like your whole life is based on it, but you have to take care of it every single day. And these people whose jobs, whose livelihoods depended on it, really understood that. And I'm aware as I'm speaking that this might seem esoteric to lawyers. And what I really want to say is, especially for me personally, the NAFTA negotiations were kind of a bonding experience, just for me as an elected Canadian leader, with everyone who works in a Canadian car plant or a Canadian car part plant, with Canadian steel workers, with Canadian aluminum workers, with people in Regina who make pipes. I knew during the NAFTA negotiations, their jobs were on the line, and they knew it too. And all of those people across Canada, they were so great. They were prepared for Canada to take a strong position. They were prepared for the US president to insult us. They were prepared for us to take really strong retaliatory actions against the 232 tariffs, because they knew how important it was for them and their jobs and their lives. And what that text exchange with Flavio represents is me sharing with him something I know he felt too, which is this really important market access that we managed to secure just a couple of years ago. It's constantly under threat. Witness the EV incentives. And it's under threat right now. And we can't let Canada be devastated this way.
Okay, you mentioned one of the steel guys. Would that be Alan Kestenbaum?
It certainly would.
Okay, well, let's pull up then ssm.can 404171. This is a text exchange you had with him on the 11th. And what he has to say is a little bit different, I think. So it's worth going through. So he sends you this and he says, "Hi, Christy, I hope you're well. I know you have your hands full. I'm not saying anything you probably don't know, but this is really impacting us badly now, like many others. And I fear that even worse, the long-term consequences of shutting down auto plants because of lack of Canadian parts will only convince the auto companies onshore even more and relocate supplies." Okay, this is a bit annoying because it's in 3 separate documents. So, Mr. Clerk, can you take that one down and put up ssm.can 404349? Record time. Okay, so that's the continuation of the text. Relocate supplies and our customers to the USA. I know it sucks politically to back down and reverse course, but it does really pay to carry on the policy, or does it really pay, to carry on the policy in support of a mandate for a vaccine that doesn't prevent the spread of Omicron and which seems to be vanishing naturally anyway. Moreover, this could create a resurgence of the right wing just like it did in America. Anyway, I know this is a massive headache for you, but it could be solved by retreating and letting it fade away from everyone's memory. Just sharing my views, hoping the spreading disruption gets resolved quickly. Okay, and then the next one, Mr. Clerk, is your response, which is ssm.can404170. And that response is, Dear Alan, thank you for reaching out. I share your concerns. We are determined to bring this to an end quickly, and we will. So what Mr. Kestenbaum is expressing there is the same concern and a suggestion that the solution to it is to alter the public health measures. So what was your reaction to that?
For me, the salient point was the first part of his message. And, you know, I think what he says there, and he runs Stelco in Hamilton. He is American, though, and US-based. What he was saying at the beginning about onshoring and relocating to the US, that's what I was talking about earlier today. And I kind of highlight that for all of us here, just to kind of make clear to everyone that for people whose bread and butter, whose livelihoods were in the US trade exposed industries, their immediate conclusion, you didn't have to think about it, the immediate conclusion from the blockage of trade was the Americans are going to respond by cutting us out. And then in terms of Alan's proposal, I didn't debate it with him. I don't think that I think that the relevant information for me from him wasn't for him to tell me what the right solution was. The relevant information for me from him was for him pointing out to me that this was a really big problem and it had to get resolved.
Okay. We're now going to skip to one of the very, very crucial days in all of this chronology, which is the 13th of February. I understand that on that day you had a call with a number of Canadian bank CEOs. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but the chronology of that day in your world goes call with the bank, afternoon around 1 p.m., IRG meeting mid-afternoon, and then cabinet meeting at 8:30 at night. Does that sound right?
It does. I'm just referring to my own chronology because there was one other meeting which is relevant, which is at 2:00 that day. I had a national security meeting on Ukraine.
Okay, fair enough.
So just to give you guys a sense of how overlapping the issues were.
Okay. Mr. Clerk, if you can pull up document, I've lost my document, ssm.can 1281, please. Okay, so we're on the 13th now, and this is an email from Meredith Tyler?
Tyler Meredith.
Tyler Meredith, I'm sorry. Can you tell us who Tyler Meredith is?
He doesn't work in my office anymore, but I think his title was strategic policy advisor, a senior policy person.
Okay. And he writes, in the timestamp of this email, it's that wonky Greenwich Mean Time thing, so that means around 11:30 in the morning, I believe. He writes, Hi, Christia, everyone is confirmed for 1 p.m. A list of CEOs is at the bottom of this email. A couple of points of background for the call. The institutions are all aware we convened a call with the Canadian Bankers Association earlier this week just to check in on whether they had any advice for us in light of recent events. The message from industry, mostly speaking that probably means from their legal counsel at the time, was we've got this under control and generally feel comfortable with the current regime. Then he says, privately, certain banks have proactively said that it might be worthwhile looking at bringing in platforms under AML, that's anti-money laundering, proceeds of crime. limiting access to payment processors. And then the last bullet is we haven't given them any indication about what's under consideration. So in all of that, it's actually the first bullet that I want to focus on most, which was this message that what had been heard from industry prior to this was, we got this. It's under control. We're comfortable with what's happening. Is that something that you were aware of, that you heard before?
So I mean, this was an extremely busy time that week. Tons and tons of stuff was happening. I had a lot of information flowing through my phone and my inbox. And I can't confirm one way or the other whether I read this specific note from Tyler. So I can't comment on this specific email. What I can say is that weekend, and you've seen sort of the disclosure of all of the things that, all of the messages that I sent and things I wrote down. What I can also say is that weekend, and I can't tell you the specific times, I had 2 one-on-one phone calls with bank CEOs, with the CEO of BMO and the CEO of TD, I believe at their request. That was unusual. I do, sort of as a matter of course, meet with the bank CEOs as a group every 6 months. And obviously they can and should have access to me, like they should be able to meet with me. But it usually takes a while for people's calendars to work and for the meeting to be arranged. And it's highly unusual for them to want to talk to me on a weekend. So that was significant to me that they wanted to talk to me on the phone. I spoke to both of them. I am sure, pretty sure, well, 90% sure I spoke to both of them before this call at 1 p.m. on Sunday with all of the bank CEOs. And each of them expressed a high degree of concern about the damage being done to Canada and the Canadian economy, which was then reflected in the group call.
Okay, so let's have a look at that group call now. Mr. Clerk, it's ssm.can 408766. So this is about a 3-page document, Mr. Freeland. I'm just going to take you to certain excerpts of it that I'd like you to elaborate on. So the first one, Mr. Clerk, if you just scroll, there we go. We don't know who's speaking here, but whoever it is, it's one of the bank CEOs, says, the big hole in our financial system is these platforms, which are effectively money service businesses that are not being regulated as such. So that these platforms refers to the payment processors, the crowdfunding platforms?
I believe so. I mean, I shouldn't put words in the mouth of another person, but I think one of the messages that I recall came through in this call, and that, you know, my memory was refreshed when I looked at these notes. One of the messages from the bank CEOs was kind of what finance had concluded independently earlier in the week, which is there's this whole space where financial transactions happen that no one has any line of sight to. And that is the crowdfunding platforms, or the crowdfunding platforms, the payment systems, and then I think someone also mentions crypto later on in this call.
Yeah, I think they do. That's right. So we'll just scroll down a little bit there. I'm not sure we're going to get to crypto just yet, but we are going to get to your response here where you say, I'm very prepared to come out and speak about this. This is an attack on democracy. We need to educate Canadians about this. What do you mean by this is an attack on democracy here?
So I was responding specifically to one of the CEOs whose bank had acted to freeze an account based on, this was prior to the invocation of the Emergencies Act. It was based, as that note shows, on what the bank's anti-money laundering systems detected. And based on that, the bank rightly acted. What was a concern for me, and this did shape how we acted, was the banks being blamed for taking this action. The banks being seen as choosing to do it, as having the agency. And it was particularly a concern. And you note the mention of Fox News. The thing you have to remember about Canadian banks is many of them are significant banks in the United States as well. They are big players there, and some of them trade under their Canadian names. And so they were in jeopardy not only in Canada, but also in the United States, if they were being seen to be taking a politicized position. I didn't think that was their responsibility. I thought it was the responsibility of the government to make judgments about this.
Okay. The next concern highlighted there is Canada's reputation is indeed at risk. We need to show the world proactively that we won't let this happen again. Our trade corridors will remain open. We should think about putting the military in place to keep the border crossings moving, even after the protesters were removed, to send a clear signal. So this is about as strong a suggestion as you can get, bring in the military. And your response though here is couldn't agree more with those points. We must make clear that one, we will resolve this, and two, we won't let this happen again. So can you explain your response there? And were you agreeing there that bringing the military to patrol the border was a viable option?
No. Okay. It was, I mean, look, if you look at that conversation, people raised lots of different points in their commentary, and I didn't respond to every single one. Just as in my previous exchange with Alan Kestelbaum, our Stelco guy, I acknowledged his concern, but I didn't really address his public health measure point. My point there was, as I said in my follow-up, that what we need to do is, as a government, one, resolve it, two, be clear it's not going to happen again. And, you know, from my perspective, the reason I convened that call, and again, probably worth highlighting, it is highly unusual for the CEOs, like highly, like never, I mean, I've only been finance minister for 2 years, but it hasn't happened before, and I hope it will never happen again. For the CEOs of all of Canada's banks on, you know, a couple of hours notice on a Sunday afternoon to come together on a Zoom call with the finance minister and deputy minister of finance. It's very, very unusual for them to find the time to do that. I'm right now trying to organize a meeting with them, my kind of every 6-month meeting for December. And it's the kind of thing that we sort of organize 4 to 6 weeks in advance, because these are all busy people. So that's kind of just worth mentioning. It shows their degree of concern and anxiety. Value for me of this meeting, why did I want to have it? What did I want to get out of it? 2 things. One, I wanted to hear from them, how worried were they? By that point, I was really worried. But we were contemplating, as you know, really serious action. And I needed to hear directly myself from the leaders of Canada's financial institutions. Did they share my level of concern? That was a very important proof point for me. So that was kind of number one. And it was important for me, for them, it was important for it to be a meeting of everyone, because that's also a measure of how worried were they, right? Are you prepared to say these things to a group of your peers? Is that's you judge your words carefully there, and you should. So number one, am I right to be as worried as I am? What do these guys think? And then number two concern was, okay, we do have some tools. How are the tools working? The people who have these tools, who are in charge of using them, how are they finding they work in practice? Those were the two things I tried to get out of the call. And it was a very useful call in terms of answering both those questions.
So maybe the next extract I wanted to point out goes to that second point. Mr. Clerk, can you just scroll down a little bit? There we go. So this is someone saying, we need court orders to act. We'd identified an individual who was an organizer who had several $100,000 move into their accounts. We flagged it to FinTrack, started work on a court order, and because of the delay of 4 hours, the money was withdrawn before we could stop it. And you say there, you ask, was the problem there a gap in the current system or that it moves too slowly? And the reply is 4 hours was too long. And then I think underneath that there's, and let's be clear, that's the reference you were talking about, and let's be clear, they will all eventually move to crypto. Okay. A little lower down, Mr. Clerk, bottom of that page, you mentioned reputational risk. That's something you've talked about several times. Here's one of those, I think, quotable quotes. Agree with my colleagues, the reputation of Canada is at risk. Just spent a lot of time in the US last week, and we were being called a quote-unquote joke by people. I had one investor say, I won't invest another red cent in your banana republic in Canada. That adds to an already tough investment perspective on Canada. Did that have any impact on that, the banana republic idea? I mean, it's hyperbolic.
Well, I mean, I believe, and subsequent conversations underscore, if I were an editor, I would ask if I were still an editor, I would ask my reporter, is that a direct quote or are you paraphrasing? And I think subsequent conversations we had show that was a direct quote. And a direct quote that a Canadian bank CEO was relaying to me that he had heard on an investment trip to the US from someone who he wanted to invest in Canada. He was trying to persuade someone to invest in Canada. And that was a heart-stopping quote for me. That was really a moment when, having already been concerned, when I really understood that what was happening was profoundly jeopardizing the Canadian economy and putting investment in Canada at risk. And, I don't expect you guys to have read our April budget, but one of the things we identify in the April budget is underinvestment as being a core problem for the Canadian economy, an Achilles heel. We don't have a high enough rate of business investment. We've done really well. I don't want to talk Canada down. Canada's fantastic. Our economy is very strong. We have a great jobs recovery from the COVID recession. But one indicator where we're underperforming is business investment. And again, that can sound like a dry thing to focus on. But a lack of business investment ultimately translates into Canadians not having jobs and Canadians not having jobs that pay well enough to maintain a good standard of living. That's what a lack of business investment means. And that quote relayed to me really made me realize I had a duty of stewardship. I have a duty. I had at that moment a very profound duty to Canadians to stand up for them. And I'm surprised that I'm getting emotional, but I really felt it. And I felt like, the Canadian economy, it could seem like this amorphous thing. Investment, it can seem amorphous. EV incentives, amorphous. But when I heard that, I realized I'm the finance minister. I'm the deputy prime minister. I have to protect Canadians. I have to protect their well-being. It's being really, really damaged. So yeah, that was a meaningful conversation for me, and that was a very memorable quote, and for sure a spur to action.
So maybe in the end, not so hyperbolic in your view.
Well, look, I can't comment on what that investor was thinking. It's secondhand, right? That was what a bank CEO reported to me an investor said to him. But it is my job to ultimately, what's the job of the finance minister? To make sure Canadians have a good life, right? And part of how Canadians have a good life is capital is invested into the Canadian economy so they have well-paying jobs. And what that quote said is something is happening in Canada that very profoundly hurts Canadian jobs. And if you go down a little bit, you'll see, and I didn't remember this until I reread this note, you know, I tried to kind of rally the troops there in the call. I tried to say, I can show you the line.
Just scroll down.
Yeah, please.
Okay, you can just direct.
So this is it. If the investor you speak of is American, I sort of said that what I was trying to do was rally the bank CEOs and kind of say to them, you guys are playing for Team Canada. Don't take that from your investors. Don't let guys, you know, I don't know if it was New York or wherever, but like, don't let those guys say to you that Canada is a banana republic. We're a great country. That's what I was trying to say there. And I was trying to say, sure, we have our problems, but, you know, as I say there, our report card looks not too shabby. I wanted the CEOs to have a confidence in Canada and the Canadian economy so that they could relay that to investors. So, you know, I put up a good, I think anyway, my objective was to imbue them with confidence because the confidence they project is important for Canada. But when I turned the Zoom off, I thought, wow, this is really serious.
Okay, the last thing I want to take you to before we put this document down is that just last little paragraph there that just came up on the screen. You say, I am very resolute in ending this occupation of our democracy, but I will never support negotiating with those who held our democracy hostage. No good thing comes of that. Can you explain that comment? You will never sanction or never support negotiating with those who hold our democracy hostage.
I think it's pretty self-explanatory. I don't think it's healthy for a democracy, for any democracy, for policy to be made, you know, at gunpoint, if you will. And that really also devalues the views and the contributions of all Canadians who express their political views and their political preferences in different ways, for example, by voting. So, yeah.
Were you referring there to the vaccine mandates, to public health measures, or more generally?
Yeah, I think, I mean, again, I don't have a sort of photographic or a video memory of exactly how that conversation evolved. And in fact, I didn't remember saying this until I read it again, but I'm sure that's a faithful account. Having read this note, what I think I was referring to is a comment made earlier in the conversation suggesting that the solution to this was a change in policy on vaccines. That's what I think I was responding to.
Okay. So we're going to leave the call now. Mr. Clerk, you can take that document down and talk about the economic impact of the protests and the blockades as you saw it and what you conveyed to your colleagues on that front. So last week when your department officials were here, we went through in some detail the initial assessment they prepared on February 10th and also the eventual February 22nd economic analysis. So we're not going to go through that in detail this morning. But what I would like to take you to is, actually, this is ssm.can 5095. These are the minutes of the February 13th IRG. So we're still on the same day here, February 13th, and that was, I believe it was around, what's the time of the IRG again? The early
4
evening,
o'clock.
around 4 o'clock? Okay.
It says right there 4 o'clock, yeah.
Thank you. I was looking at my paper, not at the screen. 4 o'clock. So in between, you had the bank call, then you had the Ukraine call that we learned about, and then 4 o'clock is the IRG. And if you scroll down to page 6, please, Mr. Clerk. Rotate there. So you're reporting to the IRG on the economic impact, and you say the minister highlighted ongoing economic losses of 0.1% to 0.2% of the GDP for every week the blockades continue. Now, we know at this point, that didn't come from an internal Department of Finance analysis. I believe you were referring to something that had been reported in a Bloomberg article. Is that right?
A Bloomberg economic analysis.
A Bloomberg
Yes.
economic analysis.
And it was also fresh in my mind because in that bank CEO conversation, that number was also referred to by one of the CEOs. So I was aware of that Bloomberg economic analysis, and I was also aware that on the street, that was the number that Canadian business leaders and international investors were seeing and citing.
So on the street, you mean on Bay Street? On
Bay Street and probably on Wall Street too.
Okay. Did you explain to your colleagues at the IRG the source of this number?
I cannot recall whether I did or not, but so I can't remember. But, it was a very busy time. A lot of people were speaking. My objective was, in a succinct way, to convey to my colleagues who aren't responsible for the economy that this was a really serious economic impact. So I think that it was possible, say you're a cabinet minister, you don't have principally economic responsibilities. You might be seeing this mostly as about, damage to Ottawa shopkeepers. And that's really serious. I don't want to understate the human toll of that. But what I wanted to communicate was this is getting to have a macro impact that will be material on the Canadian economy. And the only other thing that I would say is, with hindsight, if anything, I feel that number, I feel that statement, if that's all I said there, I feel that statement understated the possible impact, because the real challenge was it was exponential. So as it happened, that trade blockade was effectively a week-long thing. And that's what statistics ended up recording. But had it gone on, then you would have seen not an arithmetic adding up the damage of week plus week plus week. I think what you would have seen, and why this really rose to the level of a profound threat to Canada's economy, was the exponential nature of it. That the longer it went on, the greater threat that the U.S. would lose faith in us and our trading relationship would be irreparably damaged. The longer it went on, the greater the threat that foreign investors would write off Canada.
Okay. So obviously that was a concern that you were expressing to your cabinet colleagues that day.
Probably more clearly to you right now than I did then, but I think I did communicate to them I was really worried.
Okay, so the overall economic impact, both near-term and long-term. We can take that down now. Thank you, Mr. Clerk. The next topic I want to address with you is another concern that was being expressed around this time. which is the issue of foreign funding and foreign influence and money flowing largely, I think, up from the U.S. To fund the convoy. So, Mr. Clerk, can you pull up, please, SSM.can 401846? So this is an after the fact, so not quite after the fact, but certainly after the invocation of the Emergencies Act discussion that you're having with your departmental officials. And if we scroll down a little bit, please, Mr. Clerk, let's keep going. I'll let you know when to stop. Keep going up. There we go. So this is a question that you've posed to your officials. And the question is, and do we have any info on foreign donations? And the response that comes back is, we do not have any information on foreign donations that entered our Canadian financial systems. It is possible that FinTrack, CSIS, or the RCMP possess information on foreign donations, but that information is not shared with the Department of Finance. So is it fair to say that at the points at which foreign influence, foreign donations were being talked about, the government wasn't actually in possession of information to corroborate that?
No, I wouldn't say that. What I would say is a couple of things. One of the things that this occupation and the blockades really brought to our attention was how little official insight we had to crowdfunding and payment platforms, how little we knew for sure about what was going on there. And we've talked about that, and we have since acted on a permanent basis to correct that. There was very good reason to believe, and in fact, the subsequent report that the commission did that I thought was very good on foreign donations documents in a lot of detail that there were foreign donations coming in to support the convoy. And so, that was happening. Our own systems were weak at officially picking that up and slow. And quite rightly, actually, there are a lot of checks and balances within the Canadian system about what finance specifically learns, right? Because law enforcement and finance operate in different silos, and certainly elected ministers and law enforcement have a lot of silos between them, and I think that's a good thing. So, yeah, so that would be my understanding of the situation.
So to summarize that, would it be fair to say you were operating with incomplete information at that?
I would 100% say that. And the other thing I would say is, we were operating in the fog of war. And things were moving very quickly in real life on the ground. We had to operate based on the best possible information we could get at every single moment. And sometimes that meant using open source information. It didn't always mean relying on official government information and analysis that came through the finance channels. And I feel, not only comfortable doing that, but that's the right thing to do. In a fast-moving, hour-by-hour situation like this, you have to gather information from a lot of different sources, reliable sources. But I believe that's the responsibility of an elected minister. And if you don't do that, my experience in government has been, quite rightly, stuff that you officially get through official channels as a minister, I don't know, it's like flour that has been sifted many, many times. It's like very pure, very verified. It's gone through a lot of different hands, and there have been a lot of different checks on it. That's a good thing because it has, Government of Canada stamp of approval. And I think it's really good for us to have those systems. But at the same time, I think to do your job as a minister, you have to be aware of and actively seek out other sources of information, including open source sources of information. And I think you have to hear some things for yourself. That's, for example, why, for me, having that call with the banks directly was really, really important. And I wasn't just going to rely on other people telling me what they were hearing.
Okay, so the last thing I want to take you to on this point is ssm.can 403807, please, Mr. Clerk. So this is a draft, Minister Freeland, of the Section 58 explanation that was reported to Parliament. I'm sure you're familiar with that, as we all are in this room right now. If we scroll down to page 8, please, Mr. Clerk. Bottom of the page, I believe. Okay, yeah, sorry, here we go. So under item number 6 there, Roman numeral. This is a paragraph in the draft or a bullet point in the draft that says there is credible evidence that significant amounts of funding for the protests come from sources outside of Canada, which raises concerns about foreign interference in Canadian affairs and questions whether they represent threats to the security of Canada. And the comment made on that underneath it is anecdotal reports of donations from outside Canada to support the protesters were given credence when on February 13th, hackers of the crowdfunding website GiveSendGo released hacked data, and it goes on to explain what happened there. But that bullet point paragraph there is credible evidence that significant amounts of funding come from sources outside Canada was removed from the eventual Section 58 explanation. Were you aware of that? And
I wasn't part of that whole process.
Okay. And do you have any comment on that at this point?
I mean, that I wasn't part of that process and of the drafting of all of that. And finance was not, we weren't the people responsible for looking at that aspect of what was going on. And, as my previous comments have kind of underscored, I think, my primary concern and anxiety around this was about the economic impact. And we've talked about that at some length, but that I felt my job was in the cabinet and as a teammate with my colleagues. What were they relying on me as the Minister of Finance to do? They were relying on me to figure out and communicate to them how big is the economic problem. And then they were relying on me to figure out and communicate to them, look, finance guys, are you doing your job here? Are you awake? Are you using all the possible tools you have to stop the problem? That was my job number 2. And then job number 3 is, okay, if you think it's a really big problem, which we did, if you think you're using all the tools which currently exist, which we did, number 3, do you have any ideas? Is there anything in the finance toolbox that could be devised that would help? That was how I understood finance's job.
Okay, so this would be more law enforcement / intelligence area.
I think
Okay. We can take that one down, Mr. Clerk, and move on to which sort of goes back to what you were just addressing, Minister Freeland. What do we do about this? So the development and the implementation of the Emergency Economic Measures Order. So again, we've heard at this point quite a bit about the orders and about what was done with them. So I want to take you to a few specific concerns that have been expressed about them. The first one being that the EMO was overbroad. In the sense that it might capture individuals who were not really directly involved in the protests, but people who donated to the protests and or had adverse effects on family members. If you freeze someone's bank account, it may be a spouse or a child or someone else who suffers. So my first question is that a concern that you were aware of? Is that a concern that you had? And is that a concern that you felt was it properly addressed within with the measures that were enacted?
Okay, that's a lot of questions, but that is kind of, I would say, core. You're getting at some core things we grappled with beforehand, during the time the measures were in force, and in our reflections afterwards. And I want to start by saying something that I was really, really worried about and extremely conscious of the whole time was, I've talked a lot about my profound conviction that Canada was in economic jeopardy. But then as we were talking about, okay, what can we do about it? I had probably an equally profound and even emotional concern of we don't want anybody to get hurt. And one of my colleagues said to me in our conversation about all of this, as we were talking constantly, and I was sort of saying we really have to act, something has to be done. And I remember a colleague saying to me, my nightmare is blood on the face of a child. And I remember that very clearly because I was worried about that. And I really was conscious that, yes, we had to end this, but it was so important for it to be ended peacefully without anybody being hurt. So that was a hugely important objective for me. I didn't want to be a person responsible for making Canada a place where people, and you have heard by now, there were reports of children, would actually get hurt in our efforts to protect the country. That was wrong. And I felt so strongly we had to look for ways to resolve this. Yes, that was urgent, but not physically hurting anyone. And look, especially not a child, but anyone was a really key objective for me. So that was one key thing. And that was a consideration that very much shaped the development and use of the financial measures. From my perspective at the time, and also with hindsight, a virtue of these measures was no blood on the face of a child, no physical coercion required. And I thought that it was good that we came up with a way of creating some economic incentives for people to leave. So that was a very important consideration. And a second really important consideration in this question, right? I think you're asking exactly the right question. It's the balance, right? I've talked a lot now about why it was such a big problem, why I think we needed to act. Are your actions kind of appropriate and proportionate? And I would say the other thing in my mind there was we needed to always have in our minds, yes, a concern about the number of people who would be restricted by these measures, but that always needed to be balanced against an awareness of the number of people who would be protected by this action. So those were the things that I chiefly had in mind. And, I think at the end of the day, it was something like 280 accounts frozen. One of the reports I remember when we were at like 240 or 241 accounts frozen, my numbers won't be exact, but I know you guys have all the numbers too. It was something like 57 people when we were at around 240. So I don't have the exact figure of how many actual people when we were at 280, but I think we have an idea of the ballpark. And so in my mind, I say, okay, that I regret that happened to those people. I really do. I would have preferred, it was a serious thing. I would have preferred not to have had to do this. But in my mind, I weigh that against what I really believe is the tens, hundreds of thousands of Canadian jobs and families that we protected. So that's kind of a high-level thing. I can talk about donations and family members if you'd like me to.
Sure. I mean, what I was going to ask you, and maybe this will lead into it, but would it be fair to say then that if it's put to you, someone is at the protest in Ottawa and gets a call, you got to come home, they've frozen the account and I can't pay the grocery bill. In a sense, that is the measure doing exactly what it was designed to do, which is create an incentive for that person to have to go home and leave the protest. That is in effect exactly what the measure was trying to do, because the purpose of it was to avoid what you saw as a worse outcome, being an enforcement action that would have potentially violent aspects to it.
I wouldn't quite go that far. Had it been possible, if we lived in a universe where, it was possible that a jointly held family account, the family members could still have access to it, but the person doing the illegal activity didn't, that would be great. But that's not how these accounts really work. So the intention was not to create any incentives on people who were not personally choosing to engage in this illegal activity. I accept that may have happened to some people, but that wasn't the intention. The intention was really clear, and I think broadly it worked, was to create non-violent, non-physical incentives for people to stop doing this illegal activity, which was hurting Canadians very much. And what I would also say is, I would have loved it if we had made the announcement on February 14th that we are going to take this action unless you leave. Ideal outcome would have been if everyone had left that night and if none of the measures had actually had to be used. There was no desire, there was no desire to be in any way punitive. There was a desire to create non-violent incentives for people to do the right thing.
Okay. I do want to talk about the donations issue. Sorry, Mr. Commissioner, I saw you looking at me. Is that break time? Or
It's any time you like. It's can be now or in 10 minutes. What's a good moment?
maybe now, might as well.
Okay, so we'll take the morning break for 15 minutes.
The commission is in recess for 15 minutes. La commission levée pour 15 minutes.
who advised Canadians that there would be deflation rather than inflation.
Right.
Her government said inflation and interest rates would stay low for decades, so that they should borrow up a storm. And her most recent advice is that Canadians should pay their $6,000 home heating bills by canceling their $13 Disney subscription. That's the advice we're getting from the finance minister. No wonder we have 40-year highs in inflation. Why won't the government reverse its inflationary taxes so that Canadians can afford to live?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservative leader lives in a 19-room government mansion, rent and mortgage-free. This mansion comes with a chef and a driveway where his chauffeur can wait to pick him up.
Order. 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 The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister from the top, please.
From the top. Mr. Speaker, the Conservative leader lives in a 19-room government mansion, rent and mortgage-free. The mansion comes with a chef and a driveway where his chauffeur can wait to pick him up. Now, all of these privileges are a recognition of the essential role of the official opposition. But with this privilege comes responsibility. And that responsibility
I'm not getting any sound here.
not giving Canadians advice. It's time for the Conservative leader today to apologize for his reckless advice. Comes with a chef and a driveway where his chauffeur can wait to pick him up. Mr. Speaker, the Conservative leader lives in a 19-room government mansion, rent and mortgage-free. This mansion comes with a chef and a driveway where his chauffeur can wait to pick him up.
Order. 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 The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister from the top, please.
From the top. Mr. Speaker, the Conservative leader lives in a 19-room government mansion, rent and mortgage-free. The mansion comes with a chef and a driveway where his chauffeur can wait to pick him up. Now, all of these privileges are a recognition of the essential role of the official opposition. But with this privilege comes responsibility. And that responsibility
I'm not getting any sound here.
not giving Canadians advice. It's time for the Conservative leader today to apologize for his reckless advice.
personal information. And the actual follow-up is, I'm just wondering whether the bank accounts will be targeted of individuals who donated to the Give, Send, Go and the GoFundMe campaigns. Are they considered designated? So you're confirming that accounts have been frozen, both personal and corporate, but you're not releasing the information. And the actual follow-up is, I'm just wondering whether the bank accounts will be targeted of individuals who donated to the Give, Send, Go and the GoFundMe campaigns. Are they considered designated people under the Emergencies Act, meaning that their credit cards could be cut and financial services are targeting them as well?
Okay, so the names of both individuals and entities, as well as crypto wallets, have been shared by the RCMP with financial institutions, and accounts have been frozen, and more accounts will be frozen. Crowdfunding platforms and payment service providers have started the registration process with FinTrack. In terms of the specifics on whose accounts are being frozen, you now have the regulations. The financial service providers have those regulations as well, and they, working with law enforcement, will be making the operational decisions.
Vice
quasi-demonic gall to announce publicly that $8 a gallon gasoline in Canada. Chrystia Freeland, the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, 2 weeks ago had the unmitigated and I would say quasi-demonic gall to announce publicly that $8 a gallon gasoline in Canada was actually probably a good thing, because Canadians should be reminded nonstop just how severe the climate crisis is every time they fill up their cars. And that's perfectly bloody fine unless you're living on the edge of your economic capability. And the fact that you can't afford to fill up your car anymore puts you into unemployment and food deprivation in relationship to your children. And that's in the rich West. And so when you hear these bloody globalist utopians talk about the necessity for higher energy costs, you remember that that comes directly at the cost of the world's poor. Chrystia Freeland, the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, 2 weeks ago had the unmitigated and I would say quasi-demonic gall to announce publicly that $8 a gallon gasoline in Canada was actually probably a good thing, because Canadians
globalism.
Okay.
You are not working. Number three question, Mr. Trudeau,
Okay.
is you've sold us out to globalism.
Okay.
You are not working for Canada. You are working for your globalist partners. I wonder how much they're paying you to betray Canada. What do we do with traitors in Canada, Mr. Trudeau? We used to hang them for treason. And you're doing that very same thing to us now. We know what you're doing.
And here's another important piece of information. Through the WEF, initiated by Klaus Schwab in 1971, Mr. Global has been training his own puppets since 1992 through the Young Global Leaders Program. Angela Merkel and Bill Gates were among the first class to graduate, the class of 1992. Even a large number of current leaders, politicians, predominantly weak personalities with, however, mostly well-trained rhetorical skills, also come from this program, including Macron in France, Kurz in Austria, Justin Trudeau in Canada, Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, but also the German Health Minister Jens Spahn and the EU Commission head Ursula von der Leyen. The Berlin Corona Committee already now has extremely incriminating evidence proving that this corona pandemic never had anything to do with health. Rather, Mr. Global's actions are aimed solely at these goals: destruction of regional economies to make the population dependent on Mr. Global's global supply chains, shifting the wealth of the world's population from the bottom to the top, to the super rich, to Mr. Global, population reduction, you can call it genocide, as well as Mr. Global gaining total control over the remaining population, and the installation of a world government under the UN, which is now under control of the World Economic Forum. We are dealing, this must be stressed once again, with megalomaniac psychopaths and sociopaths, which must be stopped and in fact should have been stopped a very long time ago.
Order à l'ordre.
Getting on time.
It's great.
Minister Freeland, when we left off, the next topic that we planned on addressing was the issue of donations. And to do that, Mr. Clerk, can you please pull up ssm.can40